Part 1, and had studied fear for 437 standard years. In that time, he had examined over 12,000 species across the known galaxy. He had watched civilizations rise and fall based on how they handled this most basic of emotions. Fear was the universal constant, the great equalizer that kept all intelligent life cautious and controllable. Every species felt it. Every species obeyed it. Until the survey team came back from Earth. The Department of Hazards occupied an entire moon orbiting the Council's capital world, and's office sat at the very center of the complex, surrounded by screens displaying real-time psychological data from 100 different planets. He had seen strange things in his long career. He had documented the who feared silence so deeply they never stopped singing. He had studied the whose terror of open spaces kept them forever underground. He had analyzed the mindful collective, who had tried to eliminate fear through neural modification and accidentally erased their survival instincts entirely. But nothing had prepared him for the report now glowing on his screen. The survey team had spent 3 local years on Earth observing the dominant species. Humans, they were called, a young race barely capable of reaching their own moon, technologically primitive by galactic standards, physically unremarkable. They were laughably short. By every measure, they should have been ordinary. They were not ordinary. And read the first section of the report 3 times. Then he contacted the survey team leader directly and demanded verification. Senior Observer X appeared on his screen looking exhausted and confused. "The data is accurate," X said. "I checked it myself 17 times. "This cannot be correct," N replied. "You are telling me that humans deliberately seek out fear for pleasure." "That is exactly what I am telling you." "That makes no sense. Fear exists to prevent organisms from engaging in dangerous behavior. It is a survival mechanism. No species would voluntarily trigger it without cause." X made a sound that N's translator interpreted as bitter laughter. "I watched a human female pay money to enter a building specifically designed to terrify her. She screamed for 20 minutes. When she came out, she was smiling. She said it was the most fun she had experienced in months. Then she went back inside to do it again." And felt his secondary hearts begin to beat faster. This was wrong. This violated everything he understood about psychology and evolution. Perhaps she was mentally damaged, an outlier. There were thousands of humans at this location, all paying to be frightened. They had constructed an entire facility dedicated to generating terror. They called it a haunted house. The name meant nothing to Anne, but the concept made his skin go pale. A building designed to create fear, not to protect against threats but to manufacture them artificially. Why would they build such a thing? "Entertainment," X said. "Recreation, fun." The word fun echoed in N's mind long after the call ended. He spent the next several hours reviewing the rest of the report, and each page was worse than the last. Humans gathered in groups to watch recorded visual stories specifically created to frighten them. They called these stories horror movies. The survey team had documented hundreds of different varieties. Stories about monsters that hunted humans in the dark. Stories about the dead rising from their graves. Stories about diseases that turned people into mindless killers. Stories about demons and ghosts and things that lurked in shadows. The humans watched these stories in darkened rooms. They watched them alone. They watched them with friends. Sometimes they watched them while eating snacks and laughing at the most terrifying parts. They also read written stories designed to prevent sleep. They listened to audio recordings meant to make them afraid of ordinary sounds. They played interactive games where failure resulted in watching their characters die in horrible ways, then immediately started over to try again. But the haunted houses were only the beginning. Humans had built machines called roller coasters. These devices served no practical purpose. They did not transport people anywhere useful. They simply lifted humans to great heights and then dropped them at high speeds while spinning and twisting through the air. The experience simulated falling to one's death. Humans lined up for hours to experience this sensation. When they got off the machines, many of them were shaking and pale. Then they got back in line to do it again. They jumped out of aircraft with nothing but fabric sheets to slow their fall. They climbed mountains that could kill them at any moment. They swam in oceans filled with predators. They explored caves so deep and dark that rescue would be impossible if anything went wrong. And they did all of this voluntarily, for fun. And set down the report and stared at the wall of his office. His mind could not process what he had learned. Fear was supposed to control behavior. It was supposed to keep organisms safe. Every model of psychological development assumed that intelligent species would naturally try to minimize fear and avoid its causes. Humans had done the opposite. They had taken fear and turned it into a game. He thought about the implications. The Galactic Council maintained order through careful management of psychological pressures. Fear of punishment kept citizens obedient. Fear of the unknown kept species from expanding too quickly. Fear of each other kept potential rivals separated. The entire system depended on fear functioning as nature intended. But if a species could learn to enjoy fear, to seek it out rather than avoid it, to treat it as entertainment rather than warning, then that species could not be controlled through normal means. The usual levers of power would not work on them. Threats would not produce compliance. Intimidation would not ensure cooperation. A species that had domesticated fear was a species that could not be managed. And reached for his communication device and began composing a message to the council leadership. His hands were trembling. He realized, afraid of what this discovery meant, afraid of what humans might become. The irony was not lost on him. He finished his message and sent it to the highest levels of government. Within hours, he received authorization to convene an emergency session of the full council. Within days, the greatest minds had gathered to hear his findings. Within weeks, a full investigation team was being assembled. But even as the bureaucratic machinery began to move and could not shake a terrible feeling, he had spent centuries studying how fear shaped civilizations. He had always believed he understood it completely. Now he was not so sure. The survey team had included one final note in their report, a small detail that had seemed unimportant at first but now echoed in his thoughts constantly. During their observations, they had witnessed a group of human children telling each other scary stories. The children had huddled together in the dark, taking turns describing terrible things: monsters under beds, creatures in closets, ghosts in empty houses. The children had been terrified. Their heart rates had elevated. Their stress hormones had spiked. By every physiological measure, they had been experiencing genuine fear. And when the stories were over, they had laughed and asked to do it again the next night. Humans did not learn to enjoy fear as adults. They started as children. They trained themselves from the earliest age to associate terror with pleasure, danger with excitement, death with adventure. This was not a coping mechanism. This was not a cultural quirk. This was deliberate conditioning, passed down through generations, refined over thousands of years. Humans had not simply learned to tolerate fear. They had domesticated it like a pet, bred it like livestock, cultivated it like a crop. And now the galaxy would have to figure out what to do about it. Part 2. Doctor had built her career on understanding terror. She had spent 200 years studying how fear affected decision-making across different species. She had written the definitive guide to psychological threat assessment. She had personally developed the techniques that the Council used to maintain order through carefully calibrated intimidation. When asked her to lead the Earth investigation team, she had accepted immediately. This was, after all, the most interesting challenge she had encountered in decades. Now, 3 months into her mission, She was beginning to wonder if she had made a mistake. The research station orbited Earth's moon, hidden from human detection by standard cloaking technology. Sat in the observation room, surrounded by screens showing data feeds from hundreds of monitoring devices planted across the planet's surface. Her team of specialists worked at stations around her, cataloging and analyzing the endless stream of information. None of it made sense. "Doctor," one of her assistants called out, "we have new data from the North American continent, another haunted house facility. This one processes over 10,000 humans per night during peak season." Pulled up the feed. She watched humans enter a large building decorated with symbols of death and decay. Inside, actors dressed as monsters jumped out at them from hidden locations. Machines created sudden loud noises. Lights flickered and went dark. The humans screamed and ran and clutched at each other in terror. Then they exited through a gift shop, purchased souvenirs commemorating their experience, and posted positive reviews on their communication networks. "The physiological data is the same as previous observations," her assistant continued. "Elevated heart rate, increased cortisol, activation of the fight-or-flight response. These humans are experiencing genuine fear." In the psychological aftermath. Positive associations. The subjects report feeling excited, energized, and bonded with their companions. Several indicate they will return next year. Rubbed her eyes. She had now observed hundreds of these facilities across the planet. They varied in intensity and theme, but the pattern was always the same. Humans paid money to be frightened. They experienced real terror, and they enjoyed it. She had initially hypothesized that this was some kind of status display. In many species, individuals demonstrated courage by facing fears. Perhaps humans were simply showing off for potential mates or establishing social hierarchies. But the data did not support this theory. Humans engaged in recreational fear activities regardless of audience. They watched horror movies alone. They read scary stories in private. They sought out terrifying experiences even when no one was watching. Her second hypothesis had been more promising. Perhaps humans used controlled fear experiences to prepare themselves for real dangers, a kind of training program. By exposing themselves to simulated threats, they might become better equipped to handle actual emergencies. This theory had also failed. Humans who regularly consumed horror entertainment did not show improved responses to genuine danger. If anything, they seemed to seek out the recreational version precisely because it was safe. They wanted the feeling of fear without the actual consequences. The truth, was beginning to realize, was much stranger. She pulled up the neurological data her team had collected over the past months. When humans experienced fear in controlled contexts, their brains released a complex cocktail of chemicals: adrenaline for alertness, cortisol for stress response, but also dopamine for pleasure, endorphins for pain relief and euphoria, oxytocin for social bonding. Somehow, humans had rewired their psychological responses to interpret controlled terror as reward. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. She looked up to see Observer X, who had been assigned to ground-level research. "I have something you need to see," X said, "in person." They transported down to the surface together, materializing in a secluded area outside a medium-sized human settlement. X led her through the streets, their forms disguised by holographic projectors that made them appear human. The settlement was preparing for something. Noticed immediately that the buildings had been decorated with strange objects: carved vegetables with faces cut into them, illuminated from within. Fake spider webs stretched across doorways. Skeletons and ghosts hung from trees. Images of monsters peered out from windows. "What is this?" she asked. "They call it Halloween," X replied. "It is a celebration that occurs once per year. The humans decorate their dwellings with symbols of death and monsters. They dress in costumes representing their fears, and they encouraged their children to participate. Stopped walking, their children. Yes, watch. As darkness fell, the streets began to fill with small humans. Children, dressed in elaborate costumes, saw tiny monsters, miniature ghosts, small witches and vampires and creatures she could not identify. The children walked from dwelling to dwelling, knocking on doors and receiving gifts of food. They are training them, whispered. It appears so. The children are taught from earliest age to associate fear imagery with positive experiences. Costumes, candy, community celebration. By adulthood, the association is fully formed. Watched a group of children approach a dwelling that had been decorated particularly elaborately. An adult human emerged wearing a terrifying mask. The children screamed and scattered, then immediately regrouped and approached again, laughing. The human removed the mask, gave them candy, and complimented their costumes. This was not just recreation. This was cultural conditioning on a massive scale. Every generation of humans was taught from childhood to find pleasure in fear, to see terror as entertainment, to associate danger with fun and death with celebration. There is more, X said. I conducted interviews. They returned to a safe location, and X played recordings of conversations with various humans. The subjects had been approached under the pretense of academic research and had answered questions openly. A young human male explained his love of horror movies. I like being scared when I know nothing can actually hurt me. It is like a workout for your emotions. You feel everything really intensely, but then it is over and you are fine. Better than fine, actually. You feel alive. An older human female described her annual visit to a haunted house. My friends and I have been going every year for 20 years now. It is tradition. We scream and grab each other, and afterward we always feel closer. Fear brings people together. A human child spoke about Halloween. I like being a monster because then I am the scary thing instead of being scared of it. And the candy is good too. Listened to recording after recording. The responses were remarkably consistent. Humans did not deny their fear. They did not claim to be immune to it. They fully acknowledged that horror movies and haunted houses and roller coasters genuinely frightened them. They simply did not see this as a problem. Fear, to humans, was not an enemy to be defeated or a warning to be heeded. It was an experience to be sought out, enjoyed, and shared with others. They had taken the most fundamental survival instinct in the universe and transformed it into social activity. When returned to the station, she spent a long time staring at the planet below, blue and green and white, rotating slowly in the darkness. Such an ordinary-looking world, such an extraordinary species. She began composing her preliminary report to the council. The words did not come easily. Humans have not conquered fear, she wrote. They have not eliminated it or suppressed it. They have done something far more remarkable. They have domesticated it. They have taken terror and turned it into a companion, a source of entertainment, a tool for social bonding. They cultivate fear deliberately, expose themselves to it voluntarily, and derive pleasure from its presence. She paused, considering how to explain the implications. This represents a fundamental challenge to our understanding of psychological control. Fear has always been assumed to be a universal limiting factor on behavior. Species avoid what frightens them. This principle underlies all our models of social management and political stability. Humans violate this principle completely. They seek out what frightens them. They pay for it. They celebrate it. They teach their children to do the same. A species that has domesticated fear cannot be controlled through intimidation. Threats will not produce the expected responses. The levers of power that work on every other species will fail against humans. She saved the report and transmitted it to council headquarters. Then she returned to the observation room to continue her research. There was so much more to learn, so much more to understand. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a small voice whispered that perhaps some things were better left unknown. Part 3. The emergency session of the Galactic Council lasted for 17 standard days and presented the evidence first. He showed recordings of haunted houses and horror movies. He displayed physiological data and psychological analyses. He explained, in careful detail, exactly what humans had done to their relationship with fear. The reaction was immediate and chaotic. Ambassador Osh of the Crystalline Hegemony demanded that all information about human fear domestication be classified at the highest level. If other species learn that fear can be tamed, he argued, it will destabilize social order across 100 systems. Fear is what keeps populations compliant. Fear is what maintains hierarchy. If citizens believe they can simply choose to enjoy fear instead of obeying it, civilization itself will collapse. Minister N of the Depths disagreed. Suppression is impossible. The survey teams have already shared preliminary findings with their home governments. Rumors are spreading. We must develop a response strategy, not pretend the problem does not exist. The debate continued for days. Some delegates argued that humans should be quarantined, their planet sealed off from galactic contact until a solution could be found. Others suggested that human fear domestication might be weaponized, turned into a technique that could benefit other species. A few voices called for immediate military action, arguing that a species immune to psychological control posed too great a threat to be allowed to develop further. But even as the council argued, events on the ground were moving faster than anyone had anticipated. Human entertainment had already begun spreading through the galactic networks. It started small. A few human horror movies translated into common galactic languages and distributed through unofficial channels. The initial audience was limited to researchers and academics studying the phenomenon, but the content proved impossible to contain. The consortium was first to report a problem. Their youth, normally docile and obedient, had begun organizing secret viewing parties. They gathered in dark rooms to watch human horror films, experiencing fear for the first time as entertainment rather than warning. The sensation was intoxicating. Within months, human horror had become a cultural phenomenon among young, with underground distribution networks and dedicated fan communities. The Mindful Collective reported similar issues. Despite their neural modifications designed to minimize emotional responses, some members had found ways to temporarily disable their fear suppression in order to experience human entertainment. The black market for horror experiences exploded overnight. Even species with radically different psychologies found themselves affected. The Silicon Singers, a machine intelligence collective, began analyzing human horror stories and reported finding them intellectually fascinating. The Dream Weavers, whose entire existence occurred in shared mental spaces, started incorporating human nightmare imagery into their collective experiences. Human fear domestication, it turned out, was contagious, and watched the chaos unfold from his office with a growing sense of helplessness. He had spent centuries believing that fear was a universal constant, a force that could be measured and predicted and used. Now that foundation was crumbling. Doctor returned from Earth with her final report. She presented it to a closed session of senior council members, her voice calm despite the magnitude of her conclusions. Humans did not develop fear domestication overnight, she explained. The process took thousands of years. They began with storytelling, sharing tales of monsters around fires. These stories served multiple purposes. They warned of real dangers. They reinforced social bonds. And they allowed individuals to experience fear in controlled contexts, building tolerance over time. She showed images of ancient human artwork depicting terrifying creatures, cave paintings of predators, sculptures of demons, masks designed to frighten. From the earliest periods of their civilization, humans have been playing with fear. They created elaborate mythologies filled with terrifying entities. They developed rituals involving simulated danger. They built their relationship with terror into their culture at the deepest level. The senior members listened in silence. Over generations, this practice became self-reinforcing. Individuals who could process fear recreationally had advantages in hunting, warfare, and exploration. They could enter dangerous situations without being paralyzed by terror. They could think clearly when others panicked. Fear domestication became a survival trait, selected for through countless generations. She paused, looking around the room. What we are seeing now is not an anomaly. It is the result of thousands of years of cultural and possibly biological evolution. Humans have spent their entire existence learning to turn fear into a tool rather than a master. We cannot reverse this. We cannot suppress it. We can only adapt to its existence. The room remained silent for a long moment. Finally, Elder N spoke. She was the oldest member of the Council, her species, one of the founding civilizations of galactic society. Her voice was thin but steady. "What do you recommend?" Took a breath. "I recommend we stop viewing humans as a threat and start viewing them as an opportunity. They have solved a problem that has plagued every civilization in history. They have found a way to experience fear without being controlled by it. If we can learn from them, we might be able to do the same." The suggestion sparked another round of debate. Many delegates remained opposed to any engagement with humans. The risks were too great, they argued, the potential for destabilization too high. But the reality on the ground made their objections irrelevant. Human entertainment continued to spread. More species developed their own versions of recreational fear. Young individuals across the galaxy discovered the strange pleasure of being safely terrified. And humans, oblivious to the chaos they had caused, continued making horror movies and building haunted houses and telling scary stories to their children. And eventually retired from his position at the Department of Hazards. His final act was to add a single note to the official record regarding humanity. The note read, "Recommend that under no circumstances should humanity be informed that other species considered fear sacred. They would almost certainly find a way to make that funny too." He had meant it as a warning, but even as he wrote the words, he found himself smiling. There was something admirable about a species that could take the universe's most ancient weapon and turn it into a toy. Something that spoke to a kind of courage that could not be measured by any standard metric. Humans had looked fear in the eye and asked if it wanted to come to a party. And somehow, despite everything, the universe was going to have to learn to live with that. In the decades that followed, things changed. Not quickly, not easily, but they changed. Human horror entertainment became legal in most systems. Fear recreation facilities opened on dozens of worlds. Species that had spent avoiding terror began to cautiously experiment with experiencing it for fun. Some adaptations were successful, others were not. Some civilizations found that recreational fear helped their citizens become more resilient and creative. Others struggled with the social disruption caused by citizens who no longer responded predictably to threats. But the genie was out of the bottle. The secret was known. Fear could be domesticated, it could be tamed, it could be turned from master into servant. Humans had shown the galaxy what was possible, and the galaxy would never be quite the same. Meanwhile, on Earth, a small child asked her father to tell her a scary story before bed. He obliged, describing a monster that lived in the shadows and crept into children's rooms at night. The child shivered with delicious terror. She pulled her blankets up to her chin and demanded another story, scarier than the first. Her father smiled and continued. This was how it had always been. This was how it would always be. Humans and their fear, playing together in the dark.